I was standing on the dock behind my grandparents' cabin on Alder Lake, New Hampshire, holding a manila envelope I had carried in my bag for 5 months without ever showing anyone. Inside it was 30 pages of paperwork that would tell my sister, in about 14 hours, that the fight she thought she was winning had already been over before she started it. The lake was flat that morning. No wind, just the kind of stillness that makes you hear your own heartbeat if you stand there long enough. I had learned to read water like that from my grandfather, who spent 30 years running freight trains and treated silence the way other men treat noise, like something you had to earn. I did not know yet that my sister's own lawyer was going to call her before lunch the next day and tell her the deal was dead. I did not know a county clerk 2 towns over was about to flag a document with my forged signature on it. What I knew, standing on that dock with my coffee going cold in my hand, was simpler than all of that. I knew I had already done the one thing that mattered, months earlier, when nobody was watching and nobody thought I needed to. There was a coil of old rope on the dock post, gray and cracked from 20 summers of weather, and a life vest my grandfather had hung there so long ago that the buckle had rusted shut. I remember running my thumb along that rusted buckle while I waited for my coffee to finish going cold. The way you touch something familiar when you need your hands to be doing anything other than shaking. Behind me, the cabin sat quiet with its shutters still closed for the season. Ahead of me, the water held its stillness like it was in on the secret, too. People who meet me now assume I am careful because I am a nurse. That is only half true. I take care of dying people for a living, mostly in their own homes, mostly in their final months, and you learn fast that paperwork matters almost as much as medicine does. You learn that grief makes people say things they do not mean and do things they cannot undo. You learn to write everything down before somebody else gets the chance to write their own version first. But the real reason I was careful started 6 years before that morning on the dock, back when my grandmother was still alive and still teaching me things she probably did not realize she was teaching. My grandmother, Louise Bennett, got sick the winter I turned 30. Nothing dramatic at first. Just a stubborn cough that would not clear and a tiredness that scared my mother more than it scared Louise herself. By spring, the doctors had a name for it. And by summer, I had given notice at the hospital where I had worked for 6 years and taken a home care position closer to Alder Lake because somebody needed to be near her, and I was the one who could be. I moved into a rental 15 minutes from the cabin my grandparents had built with their own hands back in the 1970s. 2 bedrooms, a wood stove, a dock. My grandfather Walter had rebuilt himself after every hard winter tried to take it out. Walter had died 9 years earlier, and Louise had kept coming up to the lake every summer anyway, alone, sweeping the porch, restocking the woodpile, keeping the place ready like he might still walk in. Walter had spent 30 years as an engineer on the freight lines that ran through central New Hampshire, and Louise used to say the cabin still ran on railroad time even after he was gone. Supper at 6, lights out by 9, a logbook on a nail by the door where he had once tracked firewood and weather the way he tracked schedules, and where Louise kept tracking it long after there was any real reason to. I picked up that habit without meaning to. By the second summer, I was the one writing the entries. For 2 years, I spent most evenings and every weekend I could get there. I read to her when her eyes got too tired to read for herself. I patched the roof over the back bedroom the summer a windstorm tore off half the shingles, standing up there with a hammer in my mouth while she shouted instructions from the yard that I mostly ignored because they were wrong and she knew it. I learned her biscuit recipe by watching her hands instead of writing anything down, because she said recipes written on paper lose the parts that matter. The cabin smelled like pine smoke and old paperbacks that had gotten damp once and never quite dried out right. I still know that smell the way some people know a person's voice. There was a particular creak in the second porch step, and a particular way the loons sounded different at dusk than they did at dawn. And I learned all of it slowly, the way you learn a person, not the way you learn a fact. Some nights Louise could not sleep, and we would sit on the porch under 2 blankets while she told me stories about the lake that had nothing to do with being sick. About the winter, the ice froze thick enough to drive a truck across it, and Walter did, once, just to prove he could. About the summer, a family of raccoons moved into the crawl space under the kitchen and refused to leave for 3 weeks. She told the same stories more than once as her memory started slipping. And I let her. Because the version she told the 3rd time was never quite the same as the first. And I liked hearing which details she kept and which ones she let go. My sister Brooke was 30 miles away in Manchester those 2 years, building a life that looked, from the outside, like everything our family was supposed to want. She had opened a boutique downtown, was dating men who drove nicer cars than anyone we grew up around, and posted photos that made her days look like something out of a catalog. She came up to the cabin maybe 4 times in those 2 years. Once for a birthday, twice for holidays she could not skip without questions. Once because Louise asked her directly. And Brooke could not say no to Louise's face even when she said no to everything else. I remember one visit in particular. A Sunday afternoon when I had just gotten Louise settled after a bad night. And Brooke stood in the kitchen watching me measure out pills into the little plastic organizer with the days of the week printed on the lid. She had a glass of wine in her hand that she had brought herself because the cabin never kept any. "You really like this, don't you?" she said. "Not a question." Playing the quiet hero. Real Meg Calloway, Saint of Alder Lake. I did not answer that. I finished with the pills, closed the lid, and asked her if she wanted to help me get Louise up for dinner. She did not. Her phone buzzed twice on the counter while we stood there, and both times she glanced at it before she glanced back at me. Like whatever was on the screen mattered more than whatever was happening in the room. She left an hour later, said she had a thing back in the city, and I watched her taillights go down the dirt road while Louise asked me, from her chair by the window, whether Brooke had eaten anything before she left. That was the shape of those 2 years. Me learning how to change dressings and read the labels on a dozen different medications, Brooke learning how to talk about family loyalty at dinner parties 3 counties away. I do not say that to make her sound cruel. I do not think she meant to be. I think she genuinely believed, back then, that her version of showing up counted for as much as mine did, that a phone call from Manchester was worth the same as an evening spent mixing pills. Nobody ever sat either of us down and told us that was not true. We each just built our own math and kept adding to it, year after year, until the totals stopped matching. Louise died in the spring. 4 years before that morning, I stood on the dock with the envelope. She went at the cabin, in the front bedroom facing the lake, the way she had told everyone for years she wanted to go. And for once, the family managed to give her exactly what she asked for. What none of us knew, until the family's longtime estate attorney, Harold Whitfield, called a small meeting 2 weeks after the funeral, was that Louise had gone to see him quietly the year before and drawn up a separate document just for the cabin, not folded into the larger family estate. Not something anyone would need to divide or negotiate. A direct transfer to me, plain and simple, effective the day she died. Harold read it out at his office in Concord with my mother Carol, my father Richard, and Brooke sitting across the table from him. My mother cried a little, the good kind of crying, and said it made sense, that I had earned it, that Louise had told her as much more than once in her last year. My father nodded along and said something about how his mother-in-law always did know her own mind. Neither of them argued. Brooke did not argue either, not out loud. But I watched her jaw tighten while Harold read the paragraph twice to make sure everyone understood the language. And at the funeral reception afterward, she found a corner of the room and stood in it with her arms crossed, talking to nobody, until our mother finally went over and coaxed her into a conversation about nothing in particular. I watched them from across the room, my mother's hand on Brooke's shoulder. Brooke nodding along to something that did not seem to be landing, and I remember thinking, only for a second, that it looked less like comfort and more like management. I did not have a better word for it then. I would find one later. I did not think much of it at the time. Grief does strange things to people's faces, and I told myself that was all it was. I did not know I was watching something get planted that would take 4 years to grow into anything visible. I did not know that an old resentment about who got praised for what, who got noticed and who got overlooked, had just been handed a very specific shape. A cabin, a dollar figure, something you could point to. The 4 years after Louise's death did not close that gap. If anything, they widened it. Brooke's boutique struggled more than she ever said out loud, and I only heard the details the way I heard most things about her life, secondhand, through an aunt or a cousin who assumed I already knew. Holidays got sharper. More than once she asked, in a voice that tried to sound casual and never quite managed it, what a place like the cabin might be worth if somebody ever decided to sell it. Nobody ever decided anything. But 5 months before my father died, after a Thanksgiving dinner where she asked that question twice in front of people who were not family, I finally acted on it. I called a trust and estate attorney named David Reyes, whose name I had gotten years earlier from a hospice patient's family and had kept, the way I keep most useful things, filed away for a day I hoped I would never need it. David's office sat above a bakery on a side street in Concord, and the whole afternoon smelled faintly of bread while we worked. He was careful and unhurried in a way I appreciated immediately, the kind of lawyer who read a sentence twice before he let you sign anything under it. We sat there for most of an afternoon while he explained, in plain terms, how a piece of property that already belonged to me outright, appraised that spring at $650,000, could be moved into an irrevocable trust, meaning I would no longer hold the title in my own name, meaning it could not be sold, mortgaged, or transferred by anyone, including me, without the specific terms of the trust being followed. He also told me about a free program most county recorders' offices in New Hampshire run, called a property fraud alert, which would notify me the moment any document was filed against a parcel with my name attached to it. Most people wait until something has already gone wrong, he said, sliding the last page across the desk for my signature. You are not most people. I did not tell him why. I just signed where he pointed and asked what else I needed to do. I signed the trust paperwork on a Thursday afternoon in April. I registered for the fraud alert that same day. I told no one. Not my mother, not my sister, not even the aunt who seemed to know everything before anyone said it out loud. It was not a secret because I suspected a specific plot. It was closer to something I had learned from years of watching families gather around deathbeds, that the people who end up protected are usually the ones who did the paperwork before they needed it, not after. My father, Richard, died 5 months later, on an ordinary Tuesday in March, from a heart attack that gave him no warning and gave the rest of us none either. He was 65. He had run a small auto parts shop on the same corner of Concord for almost 30 years, and half the mechanics in 3 counties came to his funeral because he had sold them parts on credit more than once and never once mentioned it again. In the weeks after, the house filled up with casseroles and relatives and the particular kind of exhausted chaos that follows a sudden death instead of a slow one. Somewhere in the middle of that chaos, I started noticing something in the way Brooke talked at the kitchen table, at the funeral home, in the hallway outside my mother's bedroom. She kept circling back to fairness, to how things should be split evenly now that Dad was gone, how none of us should be greedy at a time like this, how family assets ought to reflect family, not who happened to be somebody's favorite. She never said the word cabin out loud those first few weeks. She did not have to. Everyone in that kitchen knew exactly what she meant. I also heard things through the wider net of relatives that Brooke never would have told me herself. Her boutique had been bleeding money for the better part of a year. She had tried flipping a house outside Manchester the previous summer, put money into renovations, and lost most of it when the sale fell through. An aunt mentioned it to my mother in the kitchen one afternoon. Not unkindly, just the way people talk when they think you already know. I did not confront Brooke about any of it. I did not bring up the cabin. I did not need to. 5 months earlier, before any of this, before my father had even died, I had already made sure there was nothing left for anyone to argue about. I just did not see any reason to tell her that yet. My mother came closer to finding out than anyone. She walked into the kitchen one evening while I was on the phone with David, going over a detail about the trust's language, and caught the tail end of a sentence with the word irrevocable in it before I noticed her and ended the call. She did not ask directly. She just looked at me a beat longer than usual, the way she used to look at me when I was 16 and had come home too quiet, and said she hoped everything was all right. I told her that was not exactly a lie. It was closer to the truth than either of us realized yet. 3 weeks after the funeral, I sat down at the long table in the conference room at Whitfield and Cross, across from 12 Relatives, a firm that had handled Callaway family business since before I was born. Oak paneling, the smell of old carpet and coffee somebody had made too strong. My mother sat at the head, pale but composed. Brooke sat 2 seats down from her, in a black dress that looked more suited to a gallery opening than a will reading, checking her phone under the table until an aunt across from her cleared her throat. Harold Whitfield had been our father's attorney for almost 20 years, and he ran the meeting the way he ran everything, without a single wasted word. He went through the small things first, the shop's remaining inventory, some savings bonds, a modest life insurance policy split evenly between my mother and the 2 of us. Nobody in the room had a problem with any of that. An uncle asked a small procedural question about the timeline for probate, and Harold answered it without looking up from his papers. A cousin near the end of the table kept refilling water glasses nobody had asked for, the way people do when they need a job to do with their hands during something this uncomfortable. My mother sat with her palms flat on the table, and I noticed, not for the first time that week, how much older her hands had gotten in the last month alone. Then he got to the paragraph about the house and what remained of Dad's assets after the shop's debts were settled, and before he could finish reading it, Brooke spoke up. "I just think," she said, loud enough that the whole table went quiet around her, "that it is a little rich for Megan to sit here acting like the responsible one when she has been sitting on Grandma's cabin for 4 years while Dad was drowning in shop debt. Maybe it is time that got folded back into what is actually fair for this family." Nobody said anything for a second. My mother's hand went still on the table. An uncle across from me looked down at his coffee like it had suddenly become very interesting. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself. I have sat in rooms with dying people and their furious, frightened families more times than I can count. And I learned a long time ago that the loudest voice in a room like that rarely wins anything worth winning. I just looked at her and said, quietly, that the cabin was not part of this conversation, because it had never been part of Dad's estate to begin with. "That is not really your call to make," Brooke said. Harold cleared his throat then, the kind of small sound that carries more weight than it should when the right person makes it. He said, plainly, that Brooke was mistaken, that the Alder Lake property had never belonged to Richard Callaway at any point in the last 4 years, and had, in fact, been transferred 5 months earlier into an irrevocable trust that placed it entirely outside the reach of the current estate proceedings, or any future ones involving the Callaway family assets. The room went silent in a way I had never felt silence work in a room before. Not the awkward, shuffling kind of quiet. Something heavier. I watched it move around the table like a current, aunt to uncle to cousin, each face doing the same small recalibration at almost the same moment. The cousin with the water pitcher set it down without pouring anything. An uncle who had been checking his watch all afternoon suddenly stopped checking it. Brooke's face went from pale to red in about 3 seconds. She asked Harold, in a voice that had lost most of its earlier confidence, when exactly this had happened and why nobody had been told. Harold told her, evenly, that a trust does not require the consent or the notification of extended family, and that its existence had nothing to do with the matter currently in front of them. She turned to me next, and for a moment I thought she might ask me directly, in front of everyone, the way she had accused me directly a minute earlier. She did not. Whatever she saw on my face, and I was not trying to show her anything in particular, seemed to answer whatever question she had been about to ask. She looked back down at the table instead. She did not say anything else. She gathered her purse, said something about needing air, and left the conference room with the door closing harder than it needed to behind her. My mother reached over and put a hand on my arm. She did not say anything either. She did not have to. For the next several days, the family did what families do after something like that happens in a room full of witnesses. They talked. An aunt called my mother to say she had always thought I deserved that cabin and always would. A cousin texted me directly to say Brooke had gone too far, that everyone had seen it, that I should not feel bad for a second. Another aunt, one who had always been closer to Brooke, said in a family group chat that maybe I could have handled things more gently, that Brooke was grieving too, and grief makes people say things. I read most of those messages once and did not answer many of them. I was not interested in a family referendum on who owed who an apology. I had spent 2 years learning that arguing with people about what they saw rarely changed what they had already decided to believe. And I did not see any reason that lesson would stop applying now. My mother sat in the middle of all of it the way she always had. She never once told Brooke directly that what she had done in that conference room was wrong. She called me twice that week to check in, gently, carefully, the way she always spoke to me when she was avoiding a harder conversation with someone else. She did not call Brooke, at least not that I ever heard about, not to scold her, not even to ask why. I did not push her on it. That was not new, and pushing had never worked before. Brooke, for her part, went quiet in public and loud in private, according to the same cousin who kept me updated whether I asked for it or not. She was, by every account I heard, furious, not at herself, at the situation, at a system that had let a lawyer she had never met keep her from something she had decided, somewhere in the last 8 months, belonged to her as much as it belonged to me. What I did not know yet, and would not learn until much later, was that Brooke had already been in contact with a man named Marcus Doyle, a developer who had spent over a year trying to assemble enough lakefront acreage on Alder Lake for a resort project he wanted to build. Doyle had approached several families around the lake with offers, including, apparently, a casual conversation with Brooke at a fundraiser 8 months earlier, where she had mentioned, in passing, that her family owned property up there. With her debt from the boutique and the failed house flip closing in around her, close to $180,000 between credit cards and the loan she had taken out for the renovation, and with the will reading fresh enough that her humiliation had curdled into something closer to entitlement than shame, Brooke reached back out to Doyle. She told him she could deliver the cabin. She told him she could move fast. Doyle, who wanted the parcel badly enough not to ask too many careful questions up front, offered her $610,000, a number comfortably under the property's real value, in exchange for speed. I did not see any of what happened next while it was happening. I learned it later, in pieces, the way you learn most things about people who have decided to stop telling you the truth. Brooke needed a document that would make it look, at least on paper, like she had a legal claim to sign over. She remembered a notary she had known years earlier from her early days trying to get a real estate license. A woman named Denise Cormier, who ran a small notary and copy shop out of a strip mall outside Manchester, and who Brooke had done small favors for once or twice, the kind of favors people remember owing. Brooke drafted a quitclaim deed that claimed to transfer 50% ownership of the Alder Lake cabin from me to her. For my signature, she used a birthday card I had sent her 3 years earlier, one with my handwriting on the inside cover, the kind of card you sign without ever thinking twice about who might keep it and why. I have pictured that notary's office more than once since then, even though I was never in it. A cramped little storefront with a laminate counter and a bell over the door. The smell of toner from the copy machine in the back. A line of customers waiting to fax something or get a passport photo taken. Denise Cormier stamped and notarized a document she had to have known did not look right, with a signature that did not match anything on file, from a woman she had not seen sign anything in years. She did it anyway. Brooke, according to what came out much later, had told her it was a simple family matter, a formality, nothing worth making complicated. Brooke hired her own attorney to handle the sale to Doyle, a real estate lawyer named Patricia Hale, who worked independently out of an office near the State House. Patricia had built her practice on exactly this kind of work: quick residential closings for clients who did not want to wait on a bigger firm's calendar. And Brooke had found her through a mutual acquaintance who described her as fast and thorough. Patricia had no idea what she was walking into. She took the forged deed at face value, the way any attorney reasonably would when a client hands over a notarized document with a plausible story attached, and began preparing the paperwork to close the sale. The forged deed was filed at the Merrimack County Recorder's office on a Tuesday morning. The clerk who accepted it did what clerks in that office do dozens of times a day: checked that the form was filled out correctly, confirmed the notary stamp was present and current, recorded it into the public record. Nobody at that counter checked whether the signature on the page actually belonged to the person it claimed to belong to. That is not how the system is built to catch a forgery. It is built to catch a form filled out wrong. It caught nothing. The alert reached David Reyes a little after 2 that afternoon. An email from the county's property fraud program, automated, unremarkable to look at. The kind of notification most people would assume was spam if they were not already expecting it. It told him a new document had been recorded against the Alder Lake parcel. He called me within the hour. I remember standing in a patient's kitchen in Concord, a hospice family's kitchen, holding my phone against my shoulder while I finished labeling a set of medications, and hearing David's voice go carefully flat in the way it did whenever something serious needed to be said without panic attached to it. He told me a quitclaim deed had been filed. He told me my name was on it as the grantor. He told me the signature did not match anything in his file. He told me not to do anything yet, that the trust already made the deed legally meaningless, but that he wanted me to know before I heard it some other way. I did not call Brooke. I did not call my mother. I went back to finishing the medication chart, because the patient in that house still needed her evening dose whether or not my sister had just tried to steal a cabin out from under a trust she did not know existed. David spent that evening confirming with the recorder's office that the trust's own filing predated the quitclaim deed by 5 clear months, a detail that would matter enormously later and meant almost nothing yet. Since Brooke had not been told any of this was already unraveling, the next morning, 30 miles away, Patricia Hale sat down to do the kind of routine work that closes most real estate deals without anyone noticing it happened at all: a title search. Standard practice before any closing, the last careful look to make sure the property being sold is actually free to sell. What she found stopped the whole transaction cold. The Alder Lake parcel was already held by an irrevocable trust, established 5 months before the deed her own client had handed her. 2 documents claiming 2 different truths about who owned the same piece of land, filed months apart, one of them plainly incompatible with the other. Patricia called Brooke that morning. I was not on that call, obviously, but I have since heard enough about the shape of it from people close to the situation to picture it clearly. Patricia telling Brooke, in the flat, careful tone attorneys use when they are choosing every word, that the deal could not proceed, that the property was not Brooke's to sell, had not been for 5 months, possibly longer, that the deed Brooke had provided directly contradicted a legally binding trust document already on file, and that Patricia needed to understand immediately and honestly where that deed had come from, because what she was looking at had every mark of a forged instrument. Brooke's own lawyer, the one she had hired to help her close a deal built on a lie, was the person who told her it was over. David filed a fraud complaint on my behalf within the week, working with the county sheriff's office and eventually a detective named Owen Pratt, who specialized in property and financial crimes. It was not a complicated case to build once the paper trail existed. The forged deed, the mismatched signature, the timeline that showed exactly when the trust was established relative to when the deed appeared. What took longer was proving intent, showing it was not some innocent mix-up, but a deliberate act. That proof came from an unexpected direction. Denise Cormier found out within weeks that her license was under review, that the state board investigating irregular notarizations had flagged her file, and that she was facing the possibility of losing her ability to work entirely, along with potential criminal liability of her own for knowingly notarizing a false signature. Facing that, she cooperated fully with investigators. She handed over text messages between herself and Brooke, weeks of them, discussing the deed, the signature, the timeline, in language that left very little room to argue it had been a misunderstanding. Brooke was formally investigated for deed fraud and forgery of a real property instrument, a felony charge in New Hampshire. I was told later that when detectives first came to speak with her, she tried to frame the whole thing as a family disagreement that had gotten out of hand, a sister's assumption that she had more right to the property than the paperwork technically allowed. That explanation did not survive contact with the text messages, or with the birthday card David had matched against the forged signature, or with Denise Cormier's cooperation. Detective Pratt told David, at one point during the process, that the case was one of the cleaner ones he had worked in years, not because the crime was small, but because the person it was committed against had made almost no mistakes worth exploiting. I did not take much pride in that when I heard it secondhand. It just confirmed something I already understood about the difference between being right and being ready. Being right had never protected anyone by itself. Marcus Doyle withdrew from the deal the day Patricia called him with the news. He was, by every account, more annoyed than sympathetic. He had spent real money on due diligence, surveys, preliminary environmental review, legal fees, and he made it known through his own attorney that he was considering a civil claim against Brooke to recover those costs, separate from whatever the state decided to do about the criminal side of things. He had no interest, his attorney told David directly, in being anywhere near a property with a criminal cloud hanging over its title. Doyle moved on to another parcel on the far side of the lake within the month, and nobody in my family ever heard from him again. I did none of the pursuing myself. I answered every question investigators asked me, honestly and completely, because that is what the law required, and because I believed, and still believe, that the truth serves everyone better than silence does. Even when the truth is unflattering to someone I love. But I did not call the district attorney's office pushing for anything. I did not need to. The paperwork did what paperwork does when it is done right months before anyone thinks to ask for it. There was one meeting with the prosecutor's office where I was asked, plainly, what outcome I wanted for my sister. I remember sitting there a long moment before I answered, because it was the first time anyone had asked me that question directly, and I had not let myself sit with it before. I said I wanted the truth on the record, and I wanted her to face whatever consequence the law decided was fair. I did not ask for more than that, and nobody in that room pushed me to. Word moves fast in a family that size, faster once there's a criminal investigation attached to it instead of just gossip. Within a month, most of the relatives who had quietly sided with Brooke after the will reading, the aunt who thought I could have handled things more gently, the cousins who had defended her in group chats, knew the shape of what she had actually done. I heard, secondhand as always, that the same aunt who had once said grief makes people say things stopped saying much of anything about it at all. Brooke's debt came out into the open the way debt eventually does once people start looking closely at someone's finances. The boutique closed within 2 months. Its remaining inventory sold off at a loss to cover part of what she owed. She moved out of her apartment in Manchester and back in with a friend, and the version of her life she had spent years presenting from the outside, the wine, the boutique, the men with the nicer cars, came apart in a way that was hard for anyone in the family to unsee, even the ones who had wanted badly to keep believing in it. My mother came to see me on a Sunday afternoon about 6 weeks after the will reading, unannounced, which she almost never did. She sat at my kitchen table for a long time before she said much of anything, turning her coffee cup slowly on the wood. She told me she had known for years that she treated Brooke and me differently, not always in ways she could point to easily, but enough that she had noticed and had chosen, over and over, not to say anything about it, because saying something felt harder than letting it sit. She said she used to tell herself it was because Brooke needed more encouragement and I needed less, that I had always been the one who could handle things on my own. And somewhere along the way that turned into a kind of permission for everyone, including her, to stop paying close attention to what I actually needed. I did not tell her it was fine. It was not entirely fine, and we both knew it, but I told her I appreciated her saying it, and that I did not think either of us needed to relitigate every year it had happened. She cried a little, the quiet kind, and asked if I could ever forgive her for staying so silent for so long. I told her I already had, mostly, and that the rest of it would come with time, the same way most real things do. We sat there another hour after that, not talking about Brooke at all, just talking about my grandmother, about the biscuit recipe, about a summer trip the four of us had taken to the coast when I was 11 and Brooke was 7, before either of us had learned to measure our worth against each other. It was the longest conversation my mother and I had had in years that was not, in some way, about damage control. I went back to the dock at Alder Lake on a Saturday morning in late September, almost 6 months after that first envelope had sat unopened in my bag. The investigation into Brooke was still moving through the system by then, slower than anyone involved would have liked, the way these things usually are. I was not there to think about any of that. My grandmother used to say something to me on that dock, years earlier, back when I was young enough to think it was just one of her sayings and not something I would carry around for the rest of my life. She said the price of a thing and the worth of a thing were rarely the same number, and that most people spent their whole lives confusing the two. I had spent 5 months protecting a piece of paper that said the cabin belonged to me. Standing there in September, I understood that the paper had never been the point. The point was 2 years of biscuit recipes and roof repairs and reading to a woman who could not read for herself anymore. The point was worth, not price, and Louise had known the difference long before I did. So I made a decision that had nothing to do with keeping score. I called a handful of the families I had worked with over the years, the ones whose loved ones I had cared for in their final months, the ones who never got a real break from watching someone they loved slowly leave them. I offered them the cabin, a few days at a time, during the warmer months, free of charge, a place to sit by a lake and remember that grief is not the only thing a family is allowed to feel together. The first family to take me up on it arrived in early October, a husband and 2 grown daughters whose wife and mother I had cared for that spring. I watched them from the porch that first evening, the daughters teaching their father how to work the old wood stove the way I had once taught myself, laughing at something none of them explained to me. And I thought about Louise's logbook still hanging on its nail by the door, waiting for someone new to start writing in it. I told my mother about it before I told anyone else. She cried again, the good kind this time, and asked whether there was room in that plan, someday, for Brooke. I did not say never. I have never believed in never. Not with my own sister. Not after everything. But I told my mother the truth, which was that I would not pretend nothing had happened, and I would not spend the rest of my life managing my sister's feelings about consequences she had chosen for herself. If Brooke ever wanted to sit at that table again, she would need to say plainly what she had done, not soften it into a story about family and fairness. And she would need to mean the apology instead of performing it for an audience the way she performed almost everything else. That is not punishment. It is not revenge either. Not really. Whatever satisfaction might come wrapped up inside it. It is closer to the thing Louise taught me on that dock without ever using a single hard word for it. Some things are worth keeping even after they have been threatened. Some people have to earn their way back to the value of something they once treated as only a price to be paid. The lake was flat again that morning, the way it had been the day I stood there with the envelope, not knowing yet what the next 14 hours would hold. I knew everything now, and for the first time in longer than I could easily remember, knowing everything felt less like a weapon I was holding and more like a kind of peace I had finally earned the right to keep.